The first is Katie Mears, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Katie Mears. I'm the director of the U.S. Disaster Program at Episcopal Relief Development, and I'm excited to talk about especially the responses on the mainland here in the U.S. from last fall.
Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Abigail Nelson, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Programs at Episcopal Relief and Development. I've been working together with Katie and all of the partners in the response to over 17 disasters that have been going on around the world, and most specifically here in the US, in Puerto Rico, and in the Virgin Islands. I look forward to sharing with you more during the course of the day.
Thank you so much. Well, we'll just jump right into the conversation. We'll probably do a little bit of presentation for about 30 minutes, and then allow 15 to 20 minutes for question and answer.
So again, good afternoon all. I'm Abigail Nelson, and today we'll be talking a lot about our response to disasters that were experienced around the world from late August through September. Episcopal Relief and Development is no stranger to disasters. We were founded in the midst of refugees fleeing Europe in the period right prior to World War II. This photo comes from 1938, when Episcopalians saw the growing humanitarian refugee crises that were coming out of Europe and responded. Over the past more than 75 years now, we've been engaged in a multiplicity of ways in response to humanitarian crises caused by natural disaster and civil unrest and war. We'll be hearing more today, again, about the work here in the United States, both on the mainland and in the Caribbean parts of the US. Throughout this work, you all as supporters, funders, and friends have been walking with us and with the partners who are responding and working in these disasters. And we're together united really in what are a series of core values. We value our faith and our faith walk together. We value the dignity of every human being who are impacted by these disasters. We value the leadership of one another and of our church and other colleagues on the ground, the leadership of everyone. And we are very committed to what we call excellence, which is just trying to be and do the very best that we can, no matter what the circumstances. Last year, as I mentioned earlier, we responded to an unprecedented number of disasters in a very short time. What you see here are just a few examples of disasters that were going on last fall, from earthquakes in Mexico, which impacted both the Diocese of Cuernavaca, the Diocese of Southeast Mexico, to landslides and floods in Sri Lanka, where we responded in Colombo and Kuranegala. The fires and mudslides in California, which are more known to us who have been watching the news, and of course all of the hurricanes, which in their devastation and in their impact have been unprecedented. Today I'll be speaking more specifically, as I mentioned earlier, about Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, but first I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Katie to speak a little bit about the work here in the mainland of the US.
I wanted to start with just a little bit of context in terms of disaster life cycles, which I think is really helpful in terms of figuring out where we are in this present moment. So as you know, a disaster recovery is a cycle, and it takes much, much longer than you would tend to think, and certainly longer than the media and the attention span often covers it. That first phase of the disaster we call rescue and short-term relief. Those are the first, couple of days, maybe into the first few weeks. And that's when all the attention is usually focused on a particular place. That's when a lot of the stuff that you imagine as disaster recovery is taking place. So the handing out of food and water, the sheltering, the rescue of people from difficult situations, all that's happening at the very beginning. you'll hear, I'm even checking myself as I'm saying this when I'm saying particular periods of time. There are certainly communities that were impacted by the disasters last fall that are still very much in short-term relief. There are places that don't yet have those sorts of short-term safety around water and food secured even at this point. But eventually, and every disaster is different, it transitions from that short-term relief into a recovery. And that recovery can last for many, many years. It can last up to 10 years. I'm imagining for many of these disasters where the devastation was severe, that's the kind of timeline that we're looking for. And in that phase, often the attention has turned away from the disaster, and it's up to the people in those communities to try to advocate for the recovery, to find casework to help individual families navigate the systems, and to begin the long process of rebuilding both the physical, but also the economy and the other systems that were often ruptured by the disaster. And then the third phase that in an ideal world, we'll have the luxury of waiting until the recovery is done before the next disaster might hit. So we're already beginning conversations in these impacted dioceses with what happens next hurricane season and how we can help equip them to be better prepared and to mitigate some of the losses in order to be more resilient going into next season. The way that we work throughout this process is using an asset-based approach. Hopefully you've heard that term, but that doesn't necessarily, it can mean lots of different things. So I want to make sure that I'm clear about what we mean when we say that. When we're talking about an asset-based community development approach to disasters, what that means is that the disaster response is based on the gifts of that particular community in that particular place. And especially in terms of how we work, what the gifts of the church are in that place. One really good example is that the Diocese of Puerto Rico is heavily involved in health promotion and health provision in that diocese. So in that diocese, we're going to build on that existing strength and have a much more health-focused program than we are in a place like the Florida Keys, where the church was involved very much in homeless ministry and ministry with communities that are marginalized, but not in a healthcare setting. So what we mean when we say an asset-based approach is building on the gifts of those churches. I think it's a huge strength of our program, but it also means it can be challenging to tell our story because it's not that we do health systems everywhere, or it's not that we do any one particular intervention anywhere. The piece that is common is building on the gifts of the church. A huge strength, though, that we see everywhere that the Episcopal Relief Development can add to a church-based response is our ability to coordinate with larger agencies. One challenge that churches can have is figuring out how they access these big systems and how, especially the people that they serve, especially the marginalized that they serve, can also often access these systems and can access them better with a little bit of help and support. So one role that Episcopal Relief and Development has played especially heavily this fall is coordinating both with the government and with other responding NGOs, and then training church-based disaster responders on how that effective response can work. What do they need to tell their parishioners in terms of applying? What do they need to encourage their AA members to do? What do they need to talk to homeless folks about as they're applying for systems? And then how can we help the churches figure out how to access those better? I'm going to talk about a couple of specific geographic examples, and again, we're happy to go into more detail if you have more specific questions down the road. But we'll start with California. The California fires and mudslides, both in the Diocese of Northern California, Diocese of San Diego, and the Diocese of Los Angeles, all had very, very significant fires last year. As I'm naming that list, I know that that's not also complete. I'm sure that the fires also got into the Diocese of San Joaquin and California as well. And what's in common is that these fires kicked up very quickly, were extremely destructive, and showed the challenges that can happen when communications are difficult and uneven. In particular, what we did in the Diocese of Los Angeles after the fires was work with the churches to figure out who was falling through the cracks of the broader system, often people who weren't, their homes weren't damaged, but whose workplaces or workplaces were displaced or their homes were damaged but not destroyed. So the diocese, we partnered with the diocese to work with several congregations to expand laundry love ministries to help low-income residents wash smoke-damaged goods, and then use the time while they were at those centers to help them apply for federal benefits and other assistance. In terms of Hurricane Harvey, it was an enormous disaster. Geographically, the number of people involved, the simple amount of time that the water stayed up, and a lot of church sort of infrastructure was in the impacted zone of this disaster. So if you can imagine the disaster, that sort of region, it's all the way from Corpus Christi all the way up to the Louisiana border and into Louisiana. We're in the impacted area. And the response that we've done has focused closely with the Diocese of Texas and the Diocese of West Texas, where the geography varies within the diocese and the geography varies between the two dioceses. The Diocese of Texas, understandably, has focused somewhat on Houston, but also has been really helpful at remembering the ways that the impact has varied even within that geography. From Beaumont to the small communities between Houston and the Gulf, the church has been active all over that area, helping all kinds of folks figure out how to get basic services at the beginning, and now helping churches begin to build the infrastructure with their communities around long-term recovery. And those systems are only now getting into place. So we're going to see a lot more activity beginning in the next couple of months in the Diocese of Texas. The Diocese of West Texas is a much more rural and coastal impacted area. It's all the communities along the Gulf, sort of north of Corpus Christi. And the church there has been enormously helpful, even while it's dealt with a lot of damage in its own right, into its own buildings and leaders. The churches there are much smaller and much more rural, as I've said, and are doing really valuable work, again, as conveners in their community and figuring out how to work with the other agencies to figure out who's going to do what. So can the Episcopal Church house while the Presbyterians build? And those sorts of pieces are being worked out on the community level as those plans come into place again over the next couple of months. As we move ahead from relief to recovery, so we're moving from provision of sort of small services in the immediate need, things like food, and moving toward a long-term recovery kind of framework. I think this program called ECHOES, which is based in Houston, is a really interesting model. They've worked with low-income residents to both provide food, but also to help access other systems for a long time. And so after the disaster hit, they were naturally in a very strong position to be able to scale up quickly. And they were able to serve thousands of people in those first few weeks and months, helping people both with food assistance, but also apply for disaster food stamps and those sorts of governmental frameworks. You'll hear a theme about food, and I think that it's really useful to remember that because the food is obviously important, not just in the ways that people need food, and that's hugely important, but one of the things that we've heard after each of these disasters is the ways that also what's been ruptured is community, and what people need is community. And the church becomes an enormously useful player in that need for people to recreate connection. And so you'll see that it's not just sort of handing food out the back of a truck, but often it's creating meal programs and ways to also create community connection. We're going to move now a little bit to the east to look at the impacts that Irma and Maria had. We know that it impacted Florida and the islands. And the variation, there's a lot of variation in terms of what was impacted where. So I'm going to talk about the impacts on Florida, and then I'm going to hand it over to Abigail to talk more specifically about the impacts in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. The program that we're focusing on in partnership with the Diocese of Southeast Florida is work in Marathon Key. Often when people think about the Keys, what you've heard of is Key West, but there are many communities along that set of islands before you get to Key West, and one of them is Marathon Key. It's a much more working class community. Many of them are people who worked in Key West, but this is a place that was more affordable. Many of the people that are involved in the program at St. Columba's and Marathon are folks who lived on boats, so the largest communities of people who live on boats full time, I think anywhere in the world. But what that means is it's relatively affordable housing in good times, but it's very, very vulnerable housing during a storm. And so the church let people shelter in their safe facilities on site, and the people that sheltered on their property have then become the nucleus with the congregational leaders to develop a long-term recovery over time. And it's been amazing to watch the leaders of this church community partner with these residents and have the line between church and community really blur in ways that I find really inspiring. With that, I'm going to hand the baton to Abigail Nelson.
As Katie mentioned, the Diocese of the Virgin Islands and the Diocese of Puerto Rico were really the two parts of our Episcopal Church polity that were most hard hit in the Caribbean by Irma and Maria. And I think it's really important when we reflect back on last fall to recall that they were about 2 weeks apart, these storms, and in many contexts, the local, in the Caribbean in particular, different islands were impacted differently. When you look at the Virgin Islands, the Diocese of the Virgin Islands covers 5 islands. When Irma hit, it hit parts of, it hit Tortola, Virgin Gorda, St. Thomas, and St. Croix sort of saw itself as spared and sent out, for example, from St. Croix, lots of relief supplies to the other islands. And then Maria came through and smacked St. Croix. So by the end of it, there was just chaos in many parts of the islands. And I'm going to speak specifically about the Virgin Islands first. Because it is intriguingly, it's a small population, but it's intriguingly complex because each island does have its own required disaster response. Our response at Episcopal Relief and Development required really new kinds of partnerships. There were parts of the islands at the time that were reporting in via text or however they could. They were running out of food and water, and so our normal response of sending funds and asking for the local church to be able to go to some local facility to get water and other things that were warehouses was just not going to be good enough. When you learn that people are at the end of their rope when it comes to water supplies. So in that particular circumstance, we reached out and found new partnerships with organizations like Convoy of Hope and increasingly Team Rubicon, which actually brings supplies into the islands. And then as discussed when Katie was sharing the importance of linking the diocese to other NGOs and other networks, our work was to provide support through those other NGOs and ask the church to link to those other NGOs, both for the supplies themselves as well as for longer term organizing. That's specifically the case in Tortola and Virgin Gorda. And St. Thomas, St. Croix, St. John, our responses again all had to be tailored slightly differently according to the requirements in the islands and the capacity of the islands at the time of initial impact. The long and the short of it across all of these 5 islands, and Puerto Rico is much the same, is that besides the food, water, and shelter challenges, power really has been one of the greatest challenges. And I know many of you have followed this in the news, but the truth is, Puerto Rico just got power back a couple of weeks ago. And so when you think of no power, that means no control of the environment. Mold continues to grow. It means places that were reliant on pumps to pump water could no longer pump. It means a whole host of complicating factors. And in all of these islands, the vulnerable children elderly and people with immunocompromised or in hospital. Many people had to be evacuated on hospital ships. And even now, today, many have not returned. Certainly the most vulnerable have not returned. The hospital systems are not back to functioning in the Virgin Islands at all. And Puerto Rico has, as Katie mentioned, a stronger hospital system at the moment. But these are all different things that are creating an environment for very complex long-term response. The geography is fascinatingly does matter. At the same time, of course, the churches, as always, have galvanized in really extraordinary ways to meet the local crises in their midst. We were walking alongside, supporting and providing support to church leaders who were doing house to house, looking for people, making sure people were not trapped under falling debris, ensuring that water and food was brought to the most isolated places. The Episcopal churches across the 52 congregations of the Diocese of Puerto Rico have set up distribution hubs all across the island. Medical, pastoral, logistics, and other kinds of support have gone through local volunteer teams. There are just extraordinary stories of people scaling mountains to bring water bottles, the only water to reach some of these mountain towns. The medical teams going out from the Hospital San Lucas and Ponce with zip lining medical supplies across raging rivers. I mean, the church really, and all of its networks of seminary, clergy, lay leaders have galvanized to distribute and respond and in really tremendous ways. And as Katie mentioned, the question of the relief phase in Puerto Rico and in the Virgin Islands has remained. I mean, we're talking about many places that are still relying on food handouts and water handouts, in particularly for clean water. Episcopal Relief and Development in both dioceses have, again, supported with on-the-ground logistics. We've had people in place in both contexts pretty regularly. We've hired local consultants who've been able to liaise with local nonprofits, NGOs, the government, and link back to those of us who are managing a variety of things here in New York and in other places, and provide those links for resources back to our diocese who are dealing with on-the-ground dynamics. Our linkages have helped to sort of provide water distribution systems. We've been looking a lot at tech as power comes back up, looking at more clean energy sources, more long-term sustainable energy sources. In the immediate, we've had to provide generators very specifically, and the diocese in both places needed generators to actually serve as locus of and hubs of distribution. And then, as I mentioned, food, water, and medical supplies have all been either sent to these places or funds sent so that they can purchase them in situ. As we kind of continue along the continuum, though, we are finally seeing, and power has been a big piece of this in both places, we're seeing the diocese now start to take a pause and say, okay, we have made it through, we're all here, we're standing, and what are we going to do with the next phase? So I've been personally in Virgin Islands a couple of times. This particular picture comes from a meeting that was held in December, actually, right before Christmas, where we were doing planning around the next phases of response in the Diocese of the Virgin Islands. Because, as I mentioned, these dioceses are moving now into mid to long-term phases, and a really important piece of this process is to look at the upcoming hurricane season, start to think through and prepare what are the resources that are needed to prepare for this upcoming season. We must also be looking at the longer term housing reconstruction, livelihood reconstruction. There's an enormous conversation going on about the church reconstruction in Virgin Islands in particular. Quite a lot of the churches have been damaged. So this particular photo comes from a meeting of conversations. This could be mirrored all across the disaster responses, where we all sit in circles a lot and talk and discern and plan and lean on each other. Because another, of course, extremely important component about processing is that capacity to tell our stories. And as Katie was mentioning, be in community together. In many contexts, like in this particular photo, the people who were together hadn't seen each other since the storms and needed a time to just process and say, how are you? How are you? A big support for this in both contexts have been companion dioceses. The Diocese of Alabama has been extraordinary in terms of helping with care and support for their brothers and sisters in Virgin Islands. Diocese of Maryland has also sent and been engaged quite a bit in care and support for folks in Puerto Rico. And I'm sure there are others that I'm not aware of, but those have been really extraordinary glue, again, of our work together as polity. The other thing that we do when we sit in these groups and we talk is we do a lot of the discernment around what Katie was talking about earlier in terms of our asset focus. What are the assets that emerged in the recovery, in the immediate relief? Where are the places that we think where people still have energy for long-term recovery? Where are the gaps? Are we seeing populations that are not being supported at all? Where do we have vulnerable people that are both assets and, in need of additional resources? And in the Virgin Islands, in this particular conversation, we've done a lot of discernment around elderly people. People whose families may be living on the mainland, who have their homes and their lives on the islands, and how the church continues to be a place of pastoral care and support and case support for these people as they rebuild their homes and their lives. Together in both places, we're looking now at forming what we call diocesan recovery committees, so that there's a nexus and a place in each diocese for the ongoing sharing of also what's happening in the responsive congregational ministries. As I mentioned earlier, we're also doing a lot of look at affordable housing. In all of these places, Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico in particular, there's a concern around the displacement of local people and the influx of people who are eager to get cheap properties for second and third homes. So again, how do we keep authenticity around and for the people who've suffered here, and keep an eye on the future, because the church has to be able to hold both in tension. In Puerto Rico, as I mentioned earlier, the vulnerable are often also identified as people who are living in these mountain communities. Puerto Rico has, San Juan, all the way to places where, getting to them, you have to ford several rivers, and how do those folks not get left behind in the wider island recovery? So as I mentioned, both dioceses are getting their long-term teams in place now for what will be not the sprint, but the long marathon of longer recovery. And they've been reflecting on what has been an extraordinary few months. There's also a lot of conversation, we'll talk about this a little bit more, around the question of volunteer management, how to receive people who want to come and support, and also how to link and support and motivate local people who are engaged in these extremely devastated places where livelihoods are impacted, where hotels and places where people used to have employment are totally also devastated and rebuilding. There's also a big conversation about ensuring anyone coming in is not replacing or displacing local jobs. So again, thinking thoughtfully about the needs and the responses for all, so that all can rebuild even stronger, is a big piece of the discussion. Finally, I do want to mention, as this particular photograph shows, the presence of local volunteers. As we know, in normal disasters, in the first 2-3 weeks of a disaster, it's really the local churches that are the hands and feet that spring up and just do extraordinary things. And in all the places that we've described, seeing faith in action and the church and the people of the church in action, you see, the face of God. It's just extraordinary the way, even with multiple Category 5 hurricanes, the death and the destruction has been so minimal. Not the destruction, but the death has been so minimal. And that's really because of people. People picking each other up out of the water, and people helping each other get out from places where they're not safe. We also see professional volunteers working locally in their communities. As Katie was mentioning earlier, the folks coming out of the hospital in Ponce, in Puerto Rico, go out and see over 1,500 people a day when they do these volunteer medical brigades to communities that are not seeing medical support. So equipping them, supporting them, and working alongside them has been a big piece of our work. And that, again, as we go forward, looking at those strengths, assessing how those strengths can be continually supported by ourselves and by people and institutions coming from the outside is the long piece, because it will be a marathon. It will be, right now we're expecting to put 12-month plans in place with both the Diocese of Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands, and I know many of the other dioceses Katie's also mentioned, but we'll be working in these places for the next 5 years at minimum. It takes, 2 weeks to destroy much, and it'll take 10 years to keep rebuilding. So we want to thank you again, friends, for all being on the call today, and for your support these past months. Really, your tip and prayers helps us in so many ways. As we continue to do the work that you would expect us to do, accompanying and supporting people who are rebuilding their lives and staying there together for the long term. Acting as the hands and feet of God in the world is not an easy thing, and it's only supported and energized by the fact that you all are with us in the network of prayer that you are, and we're so very grateful. We would very much love to address any questions that you have. So I know there's enough time to do that tomorrow.
Yes, it looks like there are a couple of questions that have come up. So the first question is, if our church wanted to help directly by sending donations to a specific church, such as the church you mentioned in Marathon, is that a helpful thing to do, or is it better to go through Episcopal Relief and Development, and why?
I'll take that question. For me, it's a both and, to be really honest. I know local clergy and local folks who know each other in local places have supported each other directly. Supporting Episcopal Relief and Development, you're really supporting much of the coordinating effort that we're sharing with you today. You're supporting the methodology. You're supporting work that will happen in the times when many people can't pay attention. We carry the load, and we will be carrying that for the long term in terms of helping respond in these places. So we feel like, it's a good thing to build individual relationships and to support the wider effort at the same time.
And then there's another question just about volunteering on the ground. So I think you talked about this a little bit, but if you wanted to expand, if a church is ready to send volunteers, how would you like that handled?
Can I start, Abigail, and then hand it off? The short answer is that often, and this is a perfect example, churches are ready to send volunteers before dioceses are quite ready to receive them. So I know that we've been saying, please wait now for a while. And that is still the answer, but what I can tell you is the answer will be changing in the very near future. So one of the things by signing up for this call, and for those of you that also get Lamplight, you'll hear about it that way. But we expect to be able to announce that several dioceses are ready to start receiving outside volunteers. Probably, I want to give myself a little bit of time, knowing that sometimes things take longer than we think, but certainly in the next month or two, we'll be able to give you an update that includes ways that you can specifically sign up to go volunteer. I know that some of you will have known someone who knows someone who knows someone that has already been, and I don't want to sort of not acknowledge that there are certainly places that have taken individual small numbers of volunteers before, but the diocese as a whole have not been ready. And that's the shift that's happening now, is that dioceses are ready to start accepting volunteers in larger numbers.
We had a question about companion dioceses. So can you expand a little bit more about that? In particular, there's a way to get us in the parishes more educated about ongoing needs of our brothers and sisters. Is this concept available for parish to parish companionships? And then another question about what exactly other dioceses have done to help in the crisis.
Abigail, do you want to start on the companion
Sure.
question?
I think I'll start from the back question and go forward. So what have other dioceses done to help? Dioceses that I'm most aware of that are companions with Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands, for example, the bishops have reached out to talk to and be of brotherly and sisterly support to the bishops in dealing with their own churches' destruction challenges with church insurance, dealing with documents, bureaucracy, support, and care. Youth folks who have had youth exchanges have sent letters. I heard of a really wonderful testimony from someone who received a letter that said, "We're thinking and praying of you," and by receiving that letter started to cry. And the comments that another person made at the time was, "So sorry, I didn't mean to make you cry with this letter." And they said, "No, you don't understand. That actually letter has helped me cry. I haven't been able to cry since the storm." So there are beautiful ways, without actually physically being there, to be in presence and prayer support with our brothers and sisters who are impacted. There are also needs. I mean, and we have clergy and lay leaders and churches that are dealing with multiple levels of devastation, and they're very tired. So there's some conversation about setting up interim support for clergy so that they can take breathers, wardens and lay leaders so they can take breathers. There's the need for vestry meetings to talk about things vestry need to talk about in a devastated church, but people to help coordinate and facilitate those discussions. And there are some conversations going on about teams for construction. I will say, and this is to again echo Katie's point, we've talked about all these needs, but nobody's been ready to receive. And it's because these dioceses are busy dealing with their own local context, and frankly there's been nowhere to have people stay. When these islands are so destroyed, the only hotels that really are open to disaster relief folks and people who've been displaced out of their own housing. So there hasn't yet been places to stay for outsiders, and that's being slowly worked on. And so like Katie, I think in the islands, we'll be very close to receiving people in the next 2 months. And we'll look forward to sort of updating people on that as those, and as I said, there'll be lots of opportunities to help in different ways.
We have just a couple more questions. There was a specific question about children and how they're being impacted and what the response is around supporting children in particular.
Abigail, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start on that one. I think like all of us and those in the eyes of impact even more so, everyone is impacted. Children are scared when it rains. Children are trying to process one day the world looked one way and the next day the whole environment is covered in water or buildings are flopped over. So we do have some resources that for this. We have on our website something called Ministering to Children After Disasters, and in all of the impacted areas we've shared those resources. basically children are encouraged to tell their stories, and children are encouraged to draw their stories, and children are encouraged to sing their stories and do whatever it is that they need to do to process. And sometimes that's really challenging for adults, because you either want your kids to be a break from the tragedy you're dealing with every minute, or you don't want to hear the same story over and over and over again. And sometimes children need to say things 1,000 times before it's out of their system. But we do encourage that there be venues for those children, and we have some resources to help. As I mentioned earlier, also in these devastated places, there are schools that are also impacted. And the school administration have also received the resources that we have along these lines. I don't know if Katie, you wanted to add anything else?
Yeah, the one interesting thing that we've seen actually in a couple of communities that relates to children is the ways that, especially in small communities, the health and the survival of a local public school is very connected to the health and the survival of that community overall. So both in the Florida Keys as well as in the Diocese of West Texas, the church has been involved in programs that were very intentional about making sure that families with school-age children were able to return to the community, which is not only sort of a humanitarian act for those particular families, but it also means that the school was able to get the funding it needed to continue to exist. Because the worry was that if the school didn't have the children, this school wouldn't get the funding that it gets per child. And if it didn't get that funding, the school would cease and then the town would be done. So I was really intrigued to see that appear as a locally driven project in several small communities impacted by disasters this year.
I want to acknowledge to everyone that we're running up a little bit on time, but there were many questions that I just thought that were important to answer. So we're just going to go through about 2 more, and then we will happily continue the conversation in other media via email and things if there are questions that did not get addressed in this call. The next question I just wanted to give 2 quick answers to was, one was a question about coordination with other agencies. And we do that through a program called Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. So we are a part of VOAD, is said for short. It is a much complicated thing, but if that's our main resource for connecting with other agencies that are not just in development. So
that then becomes enormously useful for churches various different scales. So there's often a VOAD at a municipal or regional level. So Greater Houston has a VOAD. Then it exists at a state level, and then it exists at a national level. So the questions about how we coordinate communication, we do some of that at a national level, but it's also extremely important for dioceses and churches to get involved in that kind of group at the local and the state level as well, because the conversations that happen nationally are enormously helpful, but the conversations that happen locally are even more helpful.
Then sorry, Abigail, go ahead.
No, and just to add to that then when the church needs to communicate or coordinate with an agency of the VOAD or the local government, they come to those conversations in their local places. And so a huge part of the work we do is also to kind of invite and bring locally impacted churches to those VOAD meetings. And there are lots of resources that are beyond the resources that we have.
I just wanted to also, there are a couple donor questions. One was about designating funds to specific areas. And so if you are having a problem doing a designation online, I would suggest that you call in and we can make sure that the fund goes exactly to where you would like it to go, and we can coordinate to figure out if we're actually working in that place. So before we take that money. So if you are having a question about how to designate specific funds, please do call in if you're not able to do that on the website. And then there's another question about, with all the disasters that happen, do you have enough money to respond to everything? And then how do you make a choice?
I mean, that to me is a theological question about what enough means. I don't know if this is my personal answer is that I am very aware of the tension between all the needs that exist in the world, and something that I return to and that I'm thinking a lot about this Lent is the idea that the sort of God's gifts and God's abundance are much larger than we have the capacity to imagine. And that sometimes when I find myself in a scarcity mindset, I need to just remember that. I need to go back to the scriptures that we use in training and that we use as teams to talk about abundance. Because sometimes it certainly feels like my instinctual answer to that question is no, there's never enough. We need more. And there's a truth in that. More resources are always enormously helpful. And I think of sometimes what we're doing is helping be the leavening in the church and in these communities to help with the ways that disaster can open people's eyes to help create some justice that has been needed for a really long time. So that's my long circular answer.
Great. And then the last question I will ask is about funding versus people. So the question exactly is, do you find it better to send funds to support local people, be employed to rebuild, or to try and send volunteer workers for local dioceses?
I love that question because I think it's important to remember that I actually think both are necessary, and that it's important to not think that only one matters. So I think that there is something incredibly empowering that we all know about working, and that to the extent that it is possible to pay people to do work to help their own communities recover, that is enormously important. And I appreciate that our programs have that kind of economic empowerment lens that we bring to the work that we do. That said, there is a need for extra folks, and doing this kind of work in community when these dioceses are ready to host people is helpful, not only because of the physical labor that we do, but because of the transformation that can happen in those experiences. So I would, again, sort of like my question, the answer about abundance, I would think of it as a yes and instead of an either or, because I think both are incredibly important.
And then I want to pause there because we have so many more questions, but we can probably do this for another 30 to 40 minutes. But just, I'll put up a final slide if you have more questions or require more information.
Can I answer the one about current flooding?
You can answer the one about current flooding.
A question came in about current flooding. And I'm in communication with bishops and diocesan offices in the impacted areas at this point. So there's nothing to be announced in this moment, but just know that most of the time when a disaster is happening in the US, we're in communication with the diocesan office and helping the diocese to discern what role the diocese has and whether they need financial resources from us or not. We're still able to be helpful in terms of connecting them with things like the daily FEMA briefing for situational awareness, or their local VOAD, or other kinds of community organizations. So at this point, we're still in the in touch and discerning phase, but that is still a meaningful step, even if it's not something more concrete yet.
And the last thing I will say is that somebody asked a question about where we work, and I would say that is often complicated because based on Katie's answer that you just heard. And the other question was about natural versus human-made disasters. And so we are in touch about both. So whether it is the shootings that happened in Las Vegas or Florida, or other mass shootings that have happened in the US, or natural disaster, that we are working with communities in both of those arenas. Any final words from our panelists before I close this out and ask Abigail to pray us out while I leave up the information? Finally, I just want to say thank you so much. Your funds that come in, your calls, your prayers, your support on Facebook, online, promoting our messaging, all of it is super and amazingly important to us. We are eternally grateful as an office. We have moments of gratitude that we share in our staff meetings, that, and often it's about the ways in which the people that have donated or sent a note or shared something on Facebook have made us feel like our work is being just amplified. And we can't say enough how much our faith in action is not just healing the world, but it's healing us. And so as a staff member, I want to personally say thank you, but as an organization, we want to especially say thank you for all that you have done to support our work. If you again have any questions or concerns that did not get answered on this webinar, I want to invite you to contact us, info@episcopalrelief.org. The recording will be available afterward, and I think it's best that we close out in prayer. So Abigail, will you pray us out?
Let us pray. God, you are God over the winds, over the sea, over the sky, over all creation. Help us to listen to one another as we respond to the enormous challenges before us. Bind us together so that we represent one will, one voice, one eye, guided towards you. Help us to remember that we are never, ever alone. Help us to draw strength from the many hands gathered round. Help us know there's always enough. All this we ask in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
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 Thank you very much. That concludes our webinar. If you have any questions or concerns, again, info@episcopalrelief.org. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.